So if your nonprofit is looking to fundraise in the state of Maine, you've got to know there are specific compliance rules. And today, we're going to break them all down for you. Welcome. You're watching part of our multi-state fundraising compliance series, where we try to make these complex regulations just a little bit clearer for nonprofit leaders. This resource is brought to you by Ironwood Registrations. So here's a question we hear all the time. Is getting your federal 501c3 status enough to fundraise in Maine? You know, it's a huge misconception. A lot of nonprofits think that once the IRS gives them the green light, they're good to go everywhere. But when you're talking about Maine, well, that's not the whole story at all. So here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll talk about Maine's core fundraising requirement. Then we'll get into who actually has to register. We'll also dive into the key exemptions, because maybe this doesn't apply to you. After that, we'll walk through the practical stuff, the registration and renewal cycle, and how to maintain ongoing compliance. And finally, we'll zoom out and take a broader look beyond just Maine. All right, first up, Maine's fundraising requirement. This is the big one, the 30-day rule. And let me tell you, it is all about timing. Okay, this is probably the most critical point to get right. Registration in Maine is proactive. You can't just start asking for donations and then register later. The state is very clear. You have to be licensed at least 30 days before you even think about soliciting your first donation from anyone in Maine. So who exactly does this 30-day rule apply to? Well, it all hinges on one little word, solicitation. Let's take a look at how Maine's regulators actually define that term, because believe me, getting this right is key. Okay, so according to Maine's Department of Professional and Financial Regulation, the definition is pretty broad. It's basically any direct or indirect request for a contribution for a charitable purpose. Simple as that. And they really mean broad. This isn't just about old school telefunds. We're talking about your website's Donate Now button, those email blasts you send out, your social media campaigns, direct mail, even in-person fundraising events. If you're doing any of that, it all counts as solicitation in their eyes. Now, it's really important to get the nuance here. If you're asking Maine residents for money, even if your nonprofit is based all the way over in California, that triggers the registration requirement. And if you hire a third party to fundraise for you, same deal. But on the flip side, things like receiving the government grant or getting funds from another private foundation, that does not count as solicitation. So that alone won't require you to register. Okay, so of course, these rules don't apply to every single organization out there. Maine has several key exemptions, so let's dig in and see if your nonprofit might actually qualify. So the first big exemption is for smaller organizations. If your nonprofit brings in less than $35,000 in contributions, and that's nationwide, not just from Maine, and all of your fundraising is done by unpaid volunteers, then you're likely exempt. There's also another way to be exempt, and this one is based on your donor base. If you receive contributions from no more than 35 people during the entire year, regardless of how much money that is, you also probably qualify for an exemption. And beyond those numbers, certain types of organizations might also be exempt just because of what they are. We're talking about most religious organizations, certain educational institutions, legitimate membership organizations, and nonprofit hospitals. Now, here's something really important to know about Maine that's different from a lot of other states. You know how some states make you fill out forms just to apply for an exemption? Well, Maine keeps it super simple. If you meet the criteria we just talked about, you're just exempt, automatically. No paperwork needed. All right, so let's say you've listened to all that and you've realized, yep, we need to register. So what does that actual process of registering and then renewing your license look like? Getting registered for the first time is pretty straightforward. First, you'll complete the application, and you can do that online or by mail. Then, you'll need to attach some required documents, like your IRS determination letter and your most recent Form 990. And finally, you submit all that with a $50 initial filing fee. Okay, now this next part is a date you'll want to circle on your calendar in bright red ink. Maine uses a fixed annual renewal cycle for everybody. It doesn't matter when you first registered, your renewal is due every single year by November 30th. And let me be clear, the state is very, very firm on this. The renewal fee is $25, and there were absolutely no extensions. If you miss that November 30th deadline, you could be looking at penalties, or you might even have to start the whole registration process from scratch. So, staying in good standing with the state is about more than just hitting that one renewal date. Let's take a quick look at what ongoing compliance really means.
And here's some pretty good news, especially for your finance or compliance team. It's actually about what Maine doesn't require. See, a lot of other states demand a whole separate detailed annual financial report, but Maine streamlines the process. The financial information they need, it's simply built right into the renewal application itself.
Okay, so we've pretty much covered Maine, but let's be realistic. Most fundraising campaigns don't just stop at one state line. So let's zoom out for a second and put all of this into the larger context of multi-state compliance. And really, the biggest takeaway here is that compliance is not a one-size-fits-all deal. The rules that work in Maine won't necessarily fly in New Hampshire or Florida. Every single state has its own deadlines, its own fees, its own exemption rules, which means if you have a national fundraising plan, you absolutely need a state-by-state compliance strategy. And that really brings us to the final and most critical question that you should be asking yourselves. As your fundraising reach grows, is your compliance strategy actually keeping up with it? It's a tough question, but it's one that every single successful nonprofit eventually has to answer.
Planning ahead is just so essential for staying compliant, both in Maine and everywhere else. If your organization needs a hand managing all these moving parts, Ironwood Registrations specializes in this exact kind of work. You can find out more at ironwoodregistrations.com. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.